So we're going to now switch gears and talk about, as it's summer, heat emergencies. I will also, and I know Dr. Huggins will talk about Recognize to Recover as we work together with Dr. Huggins and the Corey Stringer Institute on our heat and cold guidelines. I will just share this, and I know he will touch on this. Heat stroke and heat-related death is a very preventable incident. And so I'm really excited to have Dr. Huggins, who is a national leader in this space, speaking to heat-related emergencies, EAPs, for our game. Dr. Huggins.
Thank you so much, George. It's an honor to be here with you all today. And without further ado, I'm going to just jump into environmental extremes, especially my environmental emergencies during exercise in the heat. So one thing that I really want to make sure is understood is that the body must adapt to exercise in the heat, but we need to do so with great caution. As you can see, you might notice a few of those players right there. We had the opportunity to host the women's national team at the Corey Stringer Institute at the University of Connecticut prior to them heading to Tokyo. And we put them in a heat chamber in conditions that they would experience in Tokyo for the purposes of adapting their bodies, their extremely fit and already heat acclimatized bodies, so that they could better withstand the heat that they would experience in Tokyo, so that none of these heat emergencies would happen to them, and they would be at at a reduced risk. We frequently will put athletes through this, and you innately as clubs are going to be doing this now, or as you approach your seasons with your athletes. And the thing to understand is that your body is constantly adapting to whatever stress or environment that you are exposing it to. So as we exercise in the heat, our body produces our byproduct is heat as well, and our core body temperature rises. The only ways that we can get rid of that heat is via sweating or losing that heat to another surface or medium or to our surrounding environment. But the predominant mechanism that we lose heat is through sweating. So sweat that actually evaporates off your skin and into the surrounding environment is going to cool your body and actually allow your body to thermoregulate properly. I always equate this to an engine in a car, right? If the engine in the car is running too hot and cannot cool, that engine will shut down and or break. Our bodies are the same way. Just because we have fluid on board doesn't mean that we are going to not have a heat-related illness. So those are big myths really to keep in mind. But the harder you push the engine, the greater the intensity of the exercise that you have with your players, the longer the duration in bad environments or hot environments, hot, humid environments, the greater the likelihood of heat illness and heat stroke. Next. So different types of heat-related illnesses are often talked about. The two most common are heat exhaustion and exertional heat stroke, and they both can be serious and potentially life-threatening conditions, but heat stroke more so than heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion is about fluid loss. So when you exercise in the heat, that sweating mechanism that we just talked about needs to continue to operate. If it doesn't operate, you're going to just continue to lose fluids if you're not replacing those fluids adequately. What will happen is you'll essentially fatigue, you'll stop exercise, and hence the term heat exhaustion, you will stop. Exertional heat stroke is different. It is a medical emergency where your body is producing more heat that it can actually get rid of. And what happens is our core body temperature gets up to levels of higher than 104, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The normal exercising body temperature is usually between 100 and 103, depending on conditions and intensity. And the most elite athletes who also train in the heat are able to tolerate higher levels of core body temperature. but that's because they're super fit. They have no underlying conditions. They're properly hydrated, and they've heat acclimatized over a period of time prior to whatever event that they're competing in. So a common myth is that you have to have heat exhaustion first to have a heat stroke. That is not the case. These things are not on a continuum. You do not move from heat cramps or to heat exhaustion to heat stroke. You can be 100% hydrated and still experience heat stroke. I have studied soccer players at my university during preseason in August, and within 20 minutes, I've seen athletes that have gotten up to 104 degrees just by virtue of going really hard, really early in the training and on a hot and humid day. So what are your jobs as coaches, as club leaders and directors? It is to educate using the Recognize to Recover heat guidelines and the policies that we've helped U.S. Soccer and George put together. You need to recognize and educate on the signs and symptoms, because if you recognize them early, you will allow for the possible rapid treatment and rapid recovery of your athlete. So what are you looking for? I've highlighted some of the, in bold there, some of the real key ones. Altered mental status. You know your athletes so well. You know what they're like normally. You know their jovial self or how they act and behave. If they're confused, if they're irritable, if they're aggressive, if they're complaining of dizziness, weakness, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, all of these different things, sometimes even a shuffling of the feet that you kind of would see in someone with a concussion, and then all of a sudden they collapse. If you're in hot conditions, if they've been training for a while, these are red flags for you as a leader of the organization. Granted, you will not be able to, unless you have medical personnel present, obtain a core body temperature for your athlete. But those are the two diagnostic criteria that we use as medical professionals to decide and determine if someone has a heat stroke. So if you see any of these things, you need to act quickly, and you need to make sure that you are activating EMS or whatever heat policy you have. And you should definitely have a heat policy, because prevention is key. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. So for a heat policy is really intended to serve as like a guide for regulating your match play, your practice sessions, hydration breaks, and even safety during extreme environmental conditions. So the heat policy should be shared with everyone. You should make sure everyone is aware of the safety precautions. And some of these things below, or that I talk about now, should be considered. So you need to consider being cognizant with the changing environmental conditions. The biggest thing that we promote in the heat guidelines for Recognize to Recover is the use of something called the wet bulb globe temperature. Okay, it is a type of heat indices. We're all familiar with heat index, but what heat index does not account for is the radiant load that comes from the sun, as well as the wind speed. And what goes into wet bulb globe temperature heat index is the ambient temperature, the humidity, the solar radiation, and the wind speed. So all of those things factor into what is the real heat stress that our athletes are experiencing. You're going to want to make sure you follow heat acclimatization guidelines and make modifications, especially during preseason practices and conditioning. Another thing is you should make sure that you plan ahead. In that top circle there, you'll see an image. That is a forecasting tool that is freely open and available for people to use, that is developed by the National Weather Service. I will have some links that I can share as well after the presentation, or if you have this presentation, those are links within the presentation there. But for example, that is, I think, the wet bulb globe temperature for tomorrow at 3 p.m. So if you look there, you see red and black and orange. So if you're in Southern Texas or Southern California there, you're going to want to, or Florida for that matter, you're not going to want to practice at 3:00 tomorrow, or you're going to have a 1 hour maximum practice if you're in those red flag conditions. And if you're in black flag, you need to look to moving to a different part of the day. But what that tool does is up to 5 days out, you can know what the wet bulb globe temperature is going to be and move a practice time or plan ahead to make sure that you don't have to modify your practice session as much as you didn't intend, when you're on the field, or if there's a game that is going to occur, talking with the referees, talking with field officials, and letting them know that, hey, we might go into a black flag condition or a red flag condition today. How are we going to handle this? What are we going to do to make sure that these athletes get enough breaks and hydration? Like I said before, hydration helps, but is not a guarantee. It's always recommended that athletes are well hydrated prior to and following the activity. During soccer, it's often difficult to get enough fluids in. I think someone else will be speaking about that in a little bit, so I won't step on any toes. But another thing is make sure that if you are able, especially at large tournaments, consider hiring and having on-site medical personnel in the form of an athletic trainer, physician, or other appropriate medical personnel for your state. And then making sure you have proper equipment. Ice, tub, towels, water, and shade are all critical to making sure that there on the right, that red square, the circle or rectangle that you see, that is a wet bulb globe temperature thermometer device. Those do have a cost with them, but that will be able to allow you to get that temperature on site and make it a little easier for you when you need to make decisions. Next. So this is directly from the heat guidelines with Recognize to Recover. If you don't have a wet bulb globe temperature thermometer, you can still figure out the WBGT temperature. So that, I know it's very small there, but it's bigger on the PDF document. If you look on the top there, it says temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, and on the side, it says relative humidity. And what you do is you can look at any on-site temperature device if you have it, or if you have a weather app or something. What you can do is look and see what the temperature is, what the humidity is. You can figure out the wet bulb globe temperature. And then what you do is you look and see what category you are in. So step 2 on the bottom is if you're in that darker category, that's category 3. Gray there is category 2, and the whiter category there is category 1. These are region-specific guidelines for wet bulb globe temperature. And on the right there, once you've found which region you're in and what your wet bulb globe temperature is, you can know what you need to do for your sessions that day. So let's say tomorrow you're in Florida and it is 90.5 degrees, which you just saw in the red there. That's going to put your athletes at 3 p.m. at a high risk for heat-related illness. What do I need to do to change my practice? Well, I can't have more than an hour of training, and I need at least 4 4-minute breaks within the hour. There can be 1 16-minute break if you should choose, but you also can't have any additional conditioning going on in that practice. You can see orange and yellow and green there as well. And black, you really need to consider either delaying or canceling. But those are really hard calls to make. So that's why I recommend the wet bulb forecasting tool. Next. So if World Cup can do it, why can't you? So the World Cup match was so hot when they went to Brazil that it was the first time that in the US-Portugal match that they allowed a water break to occur. So, if for folks to say we can't talk to the officials beforehand and talk about a water break, we can't talk about an additional 5 to 10 minutes of ensuring that we have that in the first and the second halves. To be honest, I think that's absolutely ridiculous. You should be able to make sure that you afford your athletes the water breaks, especially during a game or a match, to be able to make sure that they don't overheat. So what are the top 5 things your club should do? Develop a comprehensive heat policy, be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of heat illness, Measure the environmental conditions using WBGT and modify your sessions to reduce the risk of heat illness. This isn't rocket science. Be smart. If it's hot, make sure your players are getting adequate breaks. Work on other drills or other skill sets that don't involve high intensity training. Reduce the overall training time so that the overall heat load on your athletes doesn't become too much. Acclimatize your players. I didn't really go into this, but acclimatization is a fancy way of saying of describing how your body naturally adapts to exercise in the heat, and traditionally takes 10 to 14 days. Days 1 through 5 are usually like one formal practice per day with a maximum of 3 hours of training time that includes warm-up, stretches, and cool down. And days 6 through 14, you can have double practice days beginning on day 6, but you can't exceed 5 hours total between the two practices. You need to have a minimum of a 3-hour rest between each training session. And the 3-hour rest period should be in a cool environment should you have a double session. Each double practice day should be followed by a single practice day, again, not to exceed 3 hours. And athletes should receive at least 1 day's rest following 6 days of continuous practice. So those are the key things for heat acclimatization. And I would always cater to the least fit player that you have on your team. If you do that, you will be very smart in ensuring that all players are safe on your field. The last is recognize heat illness immediately, remove the athlete from the heat, and really start cooling on site if possible. Heat stroke, the longer the amount of time that you are above 104, 105 degrees, the greater the cell death that occurs, and the less likely that your athlete is to survive. We say that there's a golden half hour. You have 30 minutes from the time that person goes into a high level, so 104, 105 or above, to get their body temperature cooled rapidly. The best way is via ice water immersion in a cold tub. If you don't have that on site, you need to start cooling with whatever materials you have, but I would plan. If I told you that the cancer, a cancer-causing, a cancer cure out there was, literally no cost and 100% effective, would you use it? I hope so, because ice and water doesn't cost anything. You literally need a vessel to put it in, and you need to make sure that person is dunked in that tub while you're waiting for EMS to arrive, especially if you're in rural locations far from EMS transport. So always activate your EAP just like you would with cardiac. Just so you know, heat stroke is the leading cause of death in the month of August. So the rest of the year, cardiac has that badge. So thank you so much, and I appreciate your time and attention. There's some key resources and you can find me as well at the Corey Stringer Institute. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Dr. Huggins. And your last point, August is the key month where we see these. It's because of the things that you talked about, meaning non-acclimated young individuals who then all of a sudden go 150 miles an hour and haven't had a progression in the temperatures in the summer. Some of the statistics are somewhere between 15 and 20 athletes die each year from heat stroke. So some really incredible information. There are a couple questions that I do want to bring up. One of them is, should practice be shortened for younger athletes, ? And still an hour when in black and or red. So if you could answer that one.
Yes. So the WBGT levels that you see there, if it's red, it's an hour maximum of training, regardless of what level you're at. The thing about kids that I will say is kids are really good at telling you they're hot and stopping. It is usually the older ages, once we get into high school age players, that they can push themselves beyond and or a coach can push a player to their limits, which is a fine line, right? You want to see what an athlete is made of, and you want to try and improve their performance on the field and deal with adversity and tough situations, but you don't want to do it at the expense of their safety. So always make sure that you're following the wet bulb globe temperature guidelines, regardless of what age. And black flag, it's if you enter black flag, or you're starting practice at black flag, if you've entered black flag and you're there for 10 to 15 minutes, you should really be considering stopping that practice, depending on where you are in the practice, right? But if you're starting practice and it's in the black flag and there's no anticipation of or indication that weather is supposed to start to get cooler, you should also consider postponing that practice or game.
Thanks, Dr. Huggins. One question that I think we've already answered is, what is the actual WBGT website address for that forecast that you had, the map? What I would direct everyone to is go to Recognize to Recover, because our website is really practical. It walks through the categories where you are in the country, and there are resources there, including links that you can utilize. And then you can also purchase a WBGT device if you need to. The next question, and I like this question, is, how do you recommend the use of ice vests before, during, or after practice? And I think understanding when we talk about performance and when we're talking about these circumstances, if you can maybe answer that one, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
Yes, sir. So ice vests. So ice vests have been commonly used in prior to any sort of activity that you anticipate in the heat for a performance benefit. What it does is oftentimes folks will warm up. They'll do their typical warm up that they normally do, 20 minute warm up in the heat. And what that does is it rises the body temperature more so in really hot and humid conditions, so much so that you're starting the game at 102 and 103 before you even, start the match. So the goal of a cooling vest is to keep the core body temperature low. But I would challenge folks to, rather than even using a cooling vest, certainly you can, if you have the ability and the funds to be able to do that, it will benefit and reduce core body temperature prior to the start of a match or a practice. But consider reducing your warm-up session, making sure that you're maybe take half the time, ensure the rest of the time is for either active cooling or drinking fluids, and just try to mitigate that rise in that person's body temperature, because you don't want them to hit the ceiling halfway through the second half. You want them to be able to finish that game without having a heat-related issue. So those are things to consider. During activity, they have been used at the half or during breaks, which again, I think is okay to use those things. But please keep in mind that the more surface area that you cover and the more of the body that you cool and the colder it is, the more you're going to reduce someone's body temperature in a significant way. You do want to be careful to not put a cooling vest on someone at the halftime and it doesn't significantly bring their body temperature down, but it makes them feel as if they're cooler when in actuality their core temp is still quite high. So be careful during activity. And I would never, ever recommend it. It is not a recommended treatment for anyone with heat illness or heat stroke post-activity. The gold standard is cold water tub or a kiddie pool or a container, if you will, an inflatable pool that has ice and water in it to be able to actually rapidly reduce someone's body temperature.
Thanks so much, Dr. Huggins. Just want to highlight, as a coach, as an organization, as you've called 911 for a youth player that is altered, irritable, that is likely heat related, your job is to rapidly start cooling them, pulling them out, getting them in shade, cooling them down in the measures that was just described. It's not standing waiting for EMS to come. It's just like a cardiac arrest, meaning that you are the bridge to their good outcome. So rapidly cool them, get them ice on them, ice towels, cool them down as EMS is coming, and let EMS know that you're concerned about a heat-related illness. Dr. Huggins, thanks so much.
Thanks, George.